Thank you, Ben and Joy. To be rich in God. All Saints Sunday. We have called the name of saints. We've called the names of pillars not only of our church, our community, our state. What is a saint? It is a Christological hero. Saint is a viable possibility if we have availability, not ability. Saint is the one who trusts and has trusted in the gospel. A saint is finally redeemed 100% by the mercy and determination for God to win us in the end. The texts in Isaiah and Revelation are lavish in their portrayal of the zealous heart of God to pour love upon us. Being a saint is about availability, not ability. Do you remember the name Robert Bowers? I thought about stories of these saints that we've called, but as sure as I did three, I would forget someone else, and so I've decided not to do that. But I do want to remind you of Robert Bowers. Do you remember him? A couple of years ago, he walked into the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh and began to shoot. Do you remember? You remember that day we called the names of those victims there? We called the names in this sanctuary that day. The story doesn't stop there, though, does it? Because when Robert Bowers was shot, put in an ambulance, and taken to the Allegheny Medical Center, standing at the front of the emergency room was Dr. Jeff Cohen. Do you remember Dr. Jeff Cohen? And do you remember the synagogue of which he is a member? The Tree of Life Synagogue. He lived right around the corner from the synagogue, or lives right around the corner from the synagogue, and heard the gunshots. He heard the gunshots and knew what was happening and what had happened, and rushed to meet the ambulances. But it wasn't just Dr. Jeff Cohen standing on the edge of the emergency room that day. One of the lead nurses in the hospital, who was in charge of all nurses that day, was standing next to Dr. Jeff Cohen. His father, a rabbi 10 miles away. These two good Jewish men, these two medical professionals, had to make a choice. On that day, would they be available? Because a decision could mean their ability, their training could mean nothing. And on that day, they chose to be available and showed us what a saint is. The ability to overcome, the ability to move past, the ability to literally transform the narrative and the brokenness of the world around us. This text today is one that is very uncomfortable for preachers. It is one that we wish wasn't there. There are things that Jesus said that we wish Jesus would have just moved on along and not touched. This is one. As one of those who wear the long robes, I wish Jesus would have just not touched this one. I can think of what some of you are thinking. You don't have any problem struggling with me in a robe, struggling and saying, that makes sense. But when you say that about Derek, you've got to recognize that Barbara's in here in a robe as well this week. Pat 2 weeks ago, standing in this pulpit wearing a robe. It's all of us. The text doesn't say some. Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes. And he doesn't even begin in there. He goes after my good friend, the Reverend Bruce Griffith, and says, beware of those who pray long prayers. Day by day by day. Beware of those who have the best seats in the synagogues. I'm so glad he said the synagogues and not Truist Park at that point, as I sat in a great seat in Game 3 of the World Series. Just a little bit of love. This text is tough. I'll be honest with you, and if you've ever sat in a leadership meeting with me, by the end I'm usually asking someone else to pray, and it's because of this text. I want to be mindful. I want to be careful. And there's also a story about Mr. Rogers that I remember. Maybe you've heard it. There was this boy who was born with an acute case of cerebral palsy, who was terribly mistreated as a child. He and his mother went to another home one day, and they watched Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, and his mother was just amazed at this boy, her son, and how animated he began to be and how excited he began to be while he watched Mr. Rogers. And she talked to a foundation and some friends of hers that she was friends with, and they figured out a way to get Mr. Rogers to visit this young boy, her son, at home. And when Mr. Rogers got there and the foundation people got there and the journalists got there, they sat and watched this young boy just be lit up with joy and excitement at being able to spend time with his hero, Mr. Rogers. And a couple hours later, at the very end of it, Mr. Rogers leaned forward, put his hand on the young boy's hand and said, "Will you pray for me?" And that young boy prayed one of the most beautiful prayers you've ever heard, Mr. Rogers tells. When Mr. Rogers was leaving and he was outside with the foundation people and the journalists, they looked at him and put their arms around him and said, "That was brilliant." To ask that young boy to pray, to give him the opportunity to pray, to give him that kind of voice and to give him that was such a gift. That was so beautiful. And Mr. Rogers looked back at them with confusion on his face and he said, "That wasn't for him. That was for me." Do you know the amount of challenges that boy has been through? Do you know the difficulty that boy that has been through? And people that have been through challenges, God is always closer to them. I wanted him praying for me. I needed him praying for me. Beware of preachers in long flowing robes who pray long prayers and demand special seating and special place and demand to be heard and demand that they are right. A couple of years ago, Jen and I, it was Christmas Advent of 2019, we were at a community function. I think it was something with the city. We were there, and even though I wasn't officially representing you, whenever I'm in public, I'm representing you. And if you've ever been in one of those situations with me, you know one horribly, horrible fact. I am the worst person at small talk you have ever met in your life. I'm horrible at it. And so Jen and I are standing there, and I don't know what to say, and this couple walks up, and I'm trying to not be horrible, and so I say to them, "Where do you go to church?" Oh no. I knew as soon as it came out, and the horror on Jen's face, I knew as soon as it came out, "Oh, why did you say that? Why did you say that? Why didn't you ask him how he let her walk out in that dress? Why didn't you say to him something about the way that they're dressed or talking? Why didn't you make fun of their children? Why did you ask where do they go to church? Because you know it's going to go badly." And they snapped. "You're not going to embarrass us for not going to church. You're not going to shame us for not going to church." No. I'm sorry, I'm not good at this. I talk to 1,000 people a week, but one-on-one, I'm just an absolute failure and a mess. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Okay. Well, now it's too late. This is what I do for a living. Now I'm in it now. So I said, "Please don't hear judgment here, but why don't you go to church?" I'm there. And they said to me, he said strongly, "We don't believe in organized religion." "Well, neither do I said. "There's nobody here that struggles with organized religion more than I do. There's nobody here that gets aggravated with preachers and religious folks and religious people who have it all figured out more than I do. We should have talked the whole time. We got plenty in common. I say twice a week, it's a miracle people go to church." I have a hard time with organized religion as well. And they asked me, then why are you a preacher? I don't know. I wonder that all the time. God, why did you call me? God, let me do something else. God, please. Please. Amen. I say it all the time. I struggle with it all the time. I sit through meetings and I go, Jesus, take me now. Amen. But there's this thing called Jesus, and he is my place. And he will not let me go. And so I wear the robe and I try to remind myself, you do not have all the answers. And I try to stay away from preachers who think they do. We were in Kansas City, or Leawood, Kansas, Church of the Resurrection, and some of it was really good, and it really does look like a spaceship from outside. The most beautiful $5 million stained glass window you have ever seen in your life. It's gorgeous. But there was an question and answer session. There was a conversation that they were having where one of the preachers made one of the most obnoxious statements I have ever heard in my life. Made one of the statements that was just, ugh. And I wanted to go home. Organized religion is what killed Jesus. And he's standing in the middle of a synagogue, Jesus, in the middle of a temple. And what they would do is they would outfit the synagogues, they would outfit the temples with these trumpet-shaped offering boxes so that when people threw in their coins, it would make this loud, clanging noise announcing the generosity of the giver, so that you would know who has just given all of this money. I read this text and it's hard not to think of Martin Luther and Johann Tetzel arguing about the sale of indulgences. We've been getting this wrong a long time, brothers and sisters. But in the days of Luther and Tetzel, indulgence hawkers would stand out carrying these large brass chests and singing their song, when the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Jesus is standing in that kind of crowd, in that kind of place, with these religious leaders who were trying to put weights on people's backs, and they're beautiful on the outside and dead on the inside. What we see in the story is Jesus saying, it's not just the wealthy who give, it is the poor giving who support the poor. It is a Christian obligation for all, even the poor. You don't know her name, Betty Von Cleek. Miss Betty, in the community I lived in 10 years ago, lived in government housing. She still lives in government housing today. She called me one day and she said, I'll see you in 30 minutes. I said, where will I see you? And she said, my house. I said, I'll be there. Did I mention she lived in government houses? Government housing, rough. I walked in and she said, we're starting a food pantry. I said, oh yeah? She said, yeah, we're going to start a food pantry. We need one. Now, Betty didn't want to start a food pantry because that's the Christian thing to do. She didn't want to start a food pantry because, that's what good people do. She wanted to start a food pantry because she knew people who were hungry. She wanted to start a food pantry because she had friends and neighbors and kids and grandkids who hadn't eaten the day before. And she looked around and she said, this is what we need. Miss Betty Von Cleek is what Jesus pictured when he was teaching this text. Beware of those in long flowing robes, and look for those who give not out of their abundance, but out of their want, who give from their shortcomings. The focal point of the text is this. It's this poignant opportunity that Jesus sits down. He sits down where they make their offerings and watched. I don't want to be manipulative here. I want to be very careful. But Jesus sat down and watched them give. 2,000 years later, he's still saying, beware of those in long robes who demand their way. But he's still watching us give as well. And he's watching our hearts, and he's watching how we serve, and he's watching how we treat one another, and how we give, not just from our abundance, but from our want. Jesus contrasts the poor widow with those who would satisfy the old saying, God notices not how much, but from how much. Martin Luther King Jr.'s daddy, Martin Luther King Sr., Mike, when he began his ministry at Ebenezer Baptist Church in 1931, he said, the problem that we have, and they were a mess and literally basically to the point where they were going to have to close the doors. He said, the problem that we have is anonymous giving. We need to get to where we know what we are giving and show what we're giving, because anonymous giving leads to anonymous non-giving. So he opened up the registers, Joey. He put a list out in the narthex that showed how much every person gave. On your way into church, you saw how much people were giving. Take a deep breath. We're not fixing to do that. But can I be honest with you, just be a pastor? If I thought it would make you a better husband or wife or mama or daddy or grandparent, if I thought it would make you a better Christian, we'd do it tomorrow. But the truth of the matter is, we'd all make a fatal mistake. We'd start at the top of the list and think that's who pleased God the most. When the text very clearly says, what pleases me is those who give from what they do not have. And it would hurt us and not help us. That would be our mistake. This Thursday is Veterans Day. One of the most powerful moments when you have with a veteran is when they tell you the moment that they took off their uniform for the last time. The joy, the agony, the mixed emotions. I've got about 15 more years of wearing this uniform. One of the things I learned these past 10 days is I'd rather go to a Braves game in the middle of May than sit through another World Series. I hope they keep winning. I hope we win 10 World Series in a row. But I love baseball, and the crowds I didn't really love that much. Because it was people who just adore baseball in May and are there for the double plays, and for this was the crowds. We have an opportunity now before the crowds show back up, brothers and sisters. We have an opportunity before the pews are full again and the classrooms are buzzing and the can't find a place to park, because it's going to come again, where we can sit down and look at one another and say, we want to be like that. We want to be a congregation. We want to be a community. We want to be Christians. We want to be a church. We are that Methodist family. And we can do that. We can begin there. But it begins here. In everything that we do, you represent Christ. In everything that we do, we represent one another. And the love and the peace and the hope of Jesus Christ holds us together. And for the next 15 years, I really don't care about the other stuff. That's where I'll be, no matter where I am. I hope today that as you picture Jesus sitting next to you, holding your hand, sitting behind you or whispering in your ear, you know that you are loved. But I also hope that you know that he expects you to be generous in everything and in all things. In everything and in all things. Amen?